Now, my talk today will be on learning about risk, on how people learn about risk, and particularly on how it is really important that we consider the environments where people learn about risk. Now, risk matters. I think we're all familiar with decisions that we make under risk where we don't quite know what we're getting. We make a decision and there are a lot of outcomes that could happen, and one of them will happen. There's uncertainty. So in a very abstract way, statisticians have often thought about, grabbing like a ball from an urn, and might be a red ball, might be the green ball. But there are a lot of practical situations where we make decisions about risk, important ones like saving for retirement, where we make decisions about investing, more or less, into stocks, bonds, savings accounts, real estate, like when we buy an apartment or a house. And all of these investments are risky. Similarly, if we choose a career paths have different risk profiles. We can be an entrepreneur, found a company, and well, that has a different risk profile compared to becoming a dentist or a teacher or a professor. When we decide to go and have a medical treatment, well, there are side effects, which can be more or less frequent and serious, and then benefits, maybe discovering a disease that you have and being able to anticipate and react early. Everyday decisions, of course, always involve risk as well. You decide to wear a helmet when you go biking. That might be a bit inconvenient. You have to carry around the helmet, but then again, in the unlikely case that you have a serious accident, your head is protected. So we make decisions about risk, but how do we make these decisions? How do we perceive risk from beliefs about the risks, and then make the decisions? Now, this is the research question that has been guiding my research over the last years. And it's not a simple problem. The real-life choices often seem contradictory. So sometimes people act as if they really are attracted to alternatives where, well, oftentimes they fail, but sometimes when they succeed, there's a huge success, right? So there's a low likelihood of a big payoff, like the guy on the left here. But then again, sometimes we act in a very different way. We pick up pennies and, well, we're at the risk of being run over by a car. Most of the time we do a little better, but then we take a risk where very infrequently we have a big loss. So there are a lot of practical examples for this. You can go to savings decisions and see that some investors, they try to find the next winner. They try to find the next, Tesla, for instance. On the other hand, there are products that are specifically designed to most of the time give you a bit of an enhancement in the gains that you have, give you a bit higher yield enhancement products. But then sometimes they do a lot worse than what you could have had otherwise. People go for both of these kinds of products. When it comes to medical procedures, sometimes people do a medical test, just to rule out a very unlikely disease they could have, even though there are side effects of these tests. In other cases, they don't take the tests because there are minor and frequent side effects. So these kinds of contradictory behaviors, they show that, well, while risk matters, we also don't quite understand how people deal with risk. It's not super simple, at least. And one reason why people could be making these kind of contradictory decisions is that people don't always learn about risk in the same way. So learning environments differ. This is a simple insight when you think about tasting foods, right? Getting a description of a food and reading that description, well, we can think about how that food would taste. But we perceive that information very differently when, instead of getting this description, we actually experience and take a bite out for that pizza. So this is an obvious example, but when it comes to risk, there's a similar thing going on. Sometimes we get a description of risk where we all at once see, well, all of the things that could happen and the likelihoods. But sometimes we also experience risk, and we see information one by one, like in our personal experiences in life. That's a different way of getting informed about risk and learning about risk. And it could lead to different decisions and different beliefs about risk. So let's look at a concrete example. In this case, we have two alternatives, two risky alternatives. Both pay between $0 and $2, right? A and B. Actually, it's a very simple distribution. In increments of 20 cents between $0 and $2. There are 11 situations that are equally likely. A and B both have this distribution. But, well, B most of the time pays a little more, 20 cents more. But in one situation, a lot less, $2 less. So this is the kind of asymmetric distribution I've described in my motivating examples. But, well, instead of learning about that distribution like this, we could also learn about it by experiencing it, by sequentially seeing information. That's how we typically in life, actually, most of the time learn about risk. We experience risk. What should that mean for our decisions? Well, rationally, it doesn't really matter how you receive that information, whether sequentially or all at once. You shouldn't make a different choice. And concretely about A and B, what should we choose? Well, rationally, both represent the same distribution, the same likelihood to get the same 11 outcomes. Well, you should be indifferent. You shouldn't care about whether you get A or B. So you should be indifferent. But we're human, right? And humans have cognitive limits. We have limited attention, limited memory. And that actually means that, especially when you consider these learning environments, different limits that we have might matter, and we might misunderstand that risk, misperceive risk, and form biased beliefs about risk. And so if we want to predict what humans do, we need to take that into account, and that's what we do in our research. We build a model, we build theory based on research from psychology, on memory and attention, and with that model, we predict what people will do. And let me just sketch that model and then show you some evidence. So in the situation where you see all information at once, that's a great summary that neatly summarizes what you have to consider here, but it's also a lot of information. And we have limited attention. And limited attention means that, well, we tend to focus on stuff that grabs our attention. In this case, what grabs people's attention is the situation on the very right, situation 11. When you look at eye tracker data, where people look in this graph, they will look at this dot on the very right bottom. That's the, in the heat map, that's the white dot on the right bottom. That is the attention-grabbing situation, 11. In that situation, A is much better than B. If people overweight that, well, they will go for A because they will believe that A is a little better than B. On the other hand, if you learn one by one about this situation, you sample or experience risk, well, what will you do? Here, limited memory matters. We're actually not that great at memorizing a lot of stuff quickly, and we'll remember a few of these situations maybe, but not many. And if you just remember a small subset of situations, you're very likely to not remember that one situation that is really important here, the situation where there's a big difference between A and B. You'll actually believe that B is better and go for B. So that's the theory. And in theory, it can explain these motivating examples that I gave you in the beginning. What about evidence, right? Does this work in practice? Well, what we could do is we could take this to actually historical data, to decisions that people make in historical data, and check whether there are correlations there that match up with our model. And the problem with that approach is historical data and correlations in historical data can be really deceptive. So just because ice cream sales and shark attacks go up in the summer, they're not causally related directly to each other. It's not like one causes the other necessarily, right? It's difficult. The approach that I typically take to solve this problem is I run randomized controlled experiments. In specific example that I'm looking at here, learning about risk, historical data has these kinds of issues as well. And you can think, for instance, about observing someone deciding to buy stocks like the next Apple that have a low likelihood of a big payoff and say, well, this shows that attention matters. But is it really that attention matters? It could also be that the media just overrepresents these kinds of extreme states. The media tends to focus on extreme salient states, right? So you have a kind of sampling error built into what you see in the world. Vice versa, if you ignore extreme events, it could just be because you have a certain personal experience, you never sampled the extreme state of that world. So you have a sampling error, and that can confound correlations in historical data. If you run randomized controlled experiments, you can control all that. We can make sure there is no sampling error. People sample just a representative sample of these 11 situations. We can also make sure that by randomizing people into either the learning environment on the left, where they see everything at once, or on the right, where they see everything one by one, we can make sure that people are not systematically different. They don't have a preference for one or the other. There's not a higher likelihood for people preferring to do well most of the time in one group that's not there in the other group. So that's how we approach this topic. We run a randomized controlled experiment with 400 people in each of these learning environments, and then we check out what they believe and what they do. So what do we find? Now, let's first talk about beliefs. We simply ask people, what do you expect for A and B? What's the average outcome you expect? What you saw is that A and B both have the same distribution. You should expect 1 for both, and the difference should be 0. So the benchmark, the rational benchmark here, is 0. What we do find is that when people see the information all at once, they actually think that B is significantly worse than A. They expect 7 cents less from B than from A. That's on the left-hand side here. That's in line with people overweighting this one extreme situation that grabs their attention. On the right, when people see everything one by one, right, they need to memorize a lot of information, maybe fail to do so, well, they remember what happens frequently, and they believe that A is actually much worse than B. So B here has a 17 cents higher average expectation than A. Although both, just to remind you, are the same, right? So beliefs are very biased in one or the other direction, depending on how you learned about risk. And then we can see that choices match with beliefs. When people learn about the situation, seeing everything all at once, well, they tend to favor A. 60% of people go for A, only around 40% go for B. When they see the 11 situations one by one, 85% of people go for B instead of going for A. So there's a huge effect on beliefs and choices. Beliefs match up with choices, so this is clearly a mistake. It's not about preferences for one or the other. People make mistakes, they form biased perceptions of reality. And so this is, I believe, an insight that's really important. It seems abstract now, but if you think about the applications, there are a lot of applications, and some of what follows now are applications that we've already looked into, but there's also some of that we still have to look into, and there's a big research agenda that I'm excited about. So consider, for instance, individual decision-making. People making decisions about retirement savings, they have to select, for instance, funds they invest into. And the European Union tells us this is kind of how you should show information for funds. You should show returns, return bars, that's the colored bars, together with a benchmark that you can compare to. There is this picture of 10 yearly returns, and that's how you can learn about the risk of a fund. At the top, that's a fund that frequently does worse than its benchmark, but then in year 7 does a lot better. At the bottom, it's the opposite. The fund frequently does a little better and then a lot worse in year 8. So same situation as with the experiment before, but a very practical, realistic decision situation where we can see how people decide. I can tell you, people go for the bottom fund, even if it's actually significantly more risky and worse in terms of average returns. So this matters in practice. And we can then take individual decisions and go to markets and look at market prices. If a lot of people make these decisions, prices will be affected. The individuals will pay more for the stocks they buy. And scarce resources in our economy will be allocated differently. You can also take this to a completely different goal. And instead of trying to describe the world better, trying to better understand what happens in the world without interfering, we could say, let's use this to improve how people make decisions, right? We better understand now how people learn and how they misperceive reality. So we could go and say, let's mix these ways of learning all at once, like here, where you see a distribution with more or less frequent outcomes. You invest 1,000 euros today and get more or less tomorrow. Instead of just showing this all at once, where people might focus too much on the outliers that happen infrequently but grab their attention, we could combine it and have people look at a simulation that shows that very frequently the middle outcomes happen that are a little better than 1,000 euros here. or around 1,000 euros. The ones at the margins that are extreme, that might be attention grabbing, they actually don't happen that frequently. And this kind of risk tool that can teach people about risk has been tested and has been shown to actually improve beliefs and choices. So there's a lot of exciting stuff to do here. Let me just quickly tell you what we found out in that research so far. We found out that learning environments matter a lot for how we learn about risk. You need to consider how people learn about risk to really understand and predict what they're going to do. This can help us better understand the world in terms of beliefs people have, choices they make, and how markets price risks. And it can help us design better choice environments where people have more reasonable beliefs that match up with the information that's actually out there, where they can then make better choices. And maybe this could lead us to reach societal goals, like people making reasonable retirement savings decisions, which is really important for a sustainable retirement savings system. Now, before I close, let me also quickly thank my co-authors and collaborators for all the projects that went into this little talk. There is a list of references at the end where you can find them. And let me thank you for your attention.